My name is Martha Miller. I'm 65 years old. I spent 32 years as a librarian in Philadelphia, and I kept a $12 flip phone hidden inside a hollowed-out dictionary in my garden shed. Warren handed me $5 that morning. For the day, he said, and logged it in a spreadsheet labeled Household Efficiency. I smiled. I said thank you. I was already counting. If this story sounds familiar, please hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. It starts the way water damage starts, invisible, then suddenly everywhere at once. Bank statements stopped arriving. My Medicare changed without my knowledge. A credit card opened in my name. A reverse mortgage on our house started without a single word to me. And one night, alone in my spare bedroom, I found a power of attorney in my own folder signed in my name. But the hook at the end of Miller was missing. He had studied my handwriting for 41 years. He still couldn't get it right. I tried to call my daughter. The line went dead. I had 11 pages of notes, and one flip phone no one knew about. He had no idea what was coming because a librarian never forgets what's been removed from the record. The cold came in through the walls before it ever came through the windows. That was something Martha Miller had learned over 41 years in this house. The way a Philadelphia winter moved, the way it worked its way through the plaster and the old insulation and settled into the bones of a place like a debt that never quite got paid off. She had always known how to manage it. A thick cardigan over her housecoat. The gas burner on low while she made her morning coffee. The second blanket pulled down from the hall closet the first week of October, without fail, every year. But this October, the thermostat said 64 degrees, and it would not say anything else. Martha stood in the kitchen in her slippers, watching the coffee maker sputter through its cycle. And she did not look at the small white Nest thermostat mounted on the wall beside the doorframe. She had learned not to look at it the way you learn not to look at a bruise, not because looking hurts more, but because you already know the shape of it by heart. 64 degrees. Warren had said it through his phone sometime before dawn, the same way he said everything now. Remotely, precisely, without discussion. The coffee finished. She poured it into her blue ceramic mug, the one with the crack along the handle. She'd been meaning to replace for 3 years, and she wrapped both hands around it and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the small backyard. The maple tree had gone fully gold. In another week, the leaves would be on the ground, and Warren would ask her to rake them before the neighbors could notice. And she would rake them, and the yard would look tidy, and no one would see anything unusual at all. That was the thing about this house. From the outside, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to be, a well-maintained row home in a good neighborhood in Northeast Philadelphia. The kind of place that appeared in the Sunday real estate supplement as a charming starter home. Even though they had lived in it for 4 decades and raised a daughter here and buried 2 cats in the backyard beside the fence. The gutters were clean. The front walk was swept. The seasonal wreath on the door, a tasteful arrangement of dried autumn leaves and small orange berries, had been approved by the Aesthetic Committee, of which Warren was the chair. From the inside, Martha was cold at 64 degrees. She had worked at the Philadelphia Free Library for 32 years before her retirement. Children's section, first. Then reference. Then, for the last 12 years of her career, she had been the head of special collections, the manuscripts, the rare periodicals. The documents that required white cotton gloves and a certain quality of silence. She had catalogued 10,000 items in that collection over her tenure. She had developed a system for everything: provenance, condition, cross-reference, secondary source. She had trained 4 assistants, written 2 departmental procedure manuals, and once located a missing deed of transfer for a legal case that 3 paralegals had spent weeks searching for. She found it in 45 minutes. Warren had always smiled when she told that story at dinner parties. "That's my Martha," he would say, in a tone that managed to sound both proud and condescending at the same time. Like a man complimenting a dog for learning a new trick. "She never forgets a filing system." He was right. She didn't. She rinsed her coffee mug and set it in the drying rack and walked down the front hallway toward the door. The mail arrived early on Wednesdays. She had noticed this during the years of retirement. She'd spent paying attention to small things, the way you do when the larger things have gradually been taken out of your hands. She opened the front door and the cold outside air met her in a rush, carrying the smell of wet leaves and distant exhaust from the avenue 2 blocks over. There was a small stack of envelopes in the mailbox. She sorted through them on the front step, her breath visible in the morning air. Electric bill, a circular from the grocery store, a card that looked like a birthday solicitation from some charity. And then near the bottom, tucked between the grocery circular and a piece of junk mail, a white envelope with the return address of the fund administrator for their retirement account. Their 401k statement. Quarterly. She had not seen one in over a year. She stood on the step with the envelope in both hands and looked at it the way she had once looked at a water-damaged manuscript. She'd pulled from a flood-damaged donation box carefully, as if the surface might give way. She turned it over. It was sealed. Her name was on it. Martha A. Miller. The address was correct. This was hers. She was already opening it when she heard Warren's footsteps on the stairs. "What have you got there?" He was dressed already, khakis pressed, flannel shirt, the reading glasses he wore pushed up on his forehead. At 69, Warren Miller still moved the way he had when he was running the floor of a union hall. With purpose, with the slight forward lean of a man who expected things to move out of his way. He had a thick gray mustache and steady brown eyes and the kind of handshake that made people feel, upon first meeting him, that they had encountered someone reliable. Martha held up the envelope. "The quarterly statement. For the 401k. I'll take that." He held out his hand. "It's addressed to me." "I know it is." He came down the last 2 steps. "I'll go over it tonight. You'll just get confused by the numbers. The allocation changed last quarter. There are new line items. It gets complicated." He took the envelope from her hand with a gentle, practiced motion, the same way you might take a glass away from a child who was carrying it near the edge of a table. "I'll explain it when I've had a chance to look it over." She watched him fold the envelope and put it in the breast pocket of his flannel shirt. "I managed 10,000 books, Warren." The words came out quieter than she intended, but they were steady. "I can manage 1 bank balance." He looked at her over the rims of his glasses, the look he used when she said something he considered mildly inconvenient, and then he smiled. "Of course you can. I'll show it to you tonight." He moved past her toward the kitchen. "Is there coffee?" She stood in the front hallway for a moment after he had gone. Then she put on her coat. She had errands to run. Warren had left her $5 on the kitchen counter the evening before, paper clipped to a small sticky note: Wednesday pharmacy, dry cleaning pickup, home by 4. She had seen him enter the amount into the spreadsheet on his laptop, the one labeled, household efficiency, in the folder on his desktop. She had not been meant to see it, or perhaps he no longer cared whether she did. She put the $5 in her coat pocket and walked out the back door and across the yard toward the small garden shed at the rear of the property. The shed smelled of potting soil and old wood and a faint trace of the lavender sachets she hung near the window every spring. She kept her gardening gloves on the shelf beside the door, her trowels hanging on the pegboard, her seed packets in labeled plastic bins along the back wall. Everything labeled, everything in its place. She moved to the far corner, behind the bags of mulch she had never quite gotten around to using, and she reached up to the 3rd shelf from the top. Behind a rusted watering can and a clay pot with a cracked base, she had placed a book. Webster's New World Dictionary, College Edition, 1972. The spine was worn. The cover was water-stained. It looked like exactly what it was, a discarded reference volume, unremarkable. The kind of thing that ended up in a garden shed through a series of small, forgettable decisions. She opened it. The inside pages had been carefully hollowed out, not destroyed, but precisely cut, the way she had learned to do with damaged volumes in special collections, removing content that had been compromised without disturbing the structural integrity of the book. In the hollow space, nestled against a folded paper towel, was a small prepaid flip phone. $12.49 at the pharmacy on Frankfurt Avenue, paid for in cash. She checked the battery. Still good. She folded the phone back into the dictionary, replaced the book on the shelf, and adjusted the watering can in front of it. Outside, through the small shed window, She could see the kitchen light go on in the back of the house. Warren was making his second cup of coffee, and the morning was proceeding exactly as he had arranged it. Martha picked up her gardening gloves and walked back across the yard toward the street. She had errands to run. But she was also, quietly and very carefully, beginning to remember something. The pharmacy on Frankfurt Avenue had been there since before Martha could remember. One of those narrow, independently owned drugstores that had survived 3 recessions and the arrival of 2 chain pharmacies within 4 blocks by virtue of having a pharmacist who knew his customers by name. Gerald Okafor had filled Martha's prescriptions for 11 years. He knew she took a low-dose blood pressure medication, a vitamin D supplement, and, since the previous spring, a medication for mild osteoporosis that her doctor had started her on after a routine bone density scan. He also knew, from the expression on his face when she slid her Medicare card across the counter that Wednesday morning, that something was wrong. Mrs. Miller. He looked at his screen, then at her card, then back at his screen. He had the careful, measured manner of a man who delivered difficult information for a living and had learned to do it without flinching. I'm showing an administrative change on your Part D coverage. As of last month, your plan designation has been updated. The osteoporosis prescription isn't covered under the new tier. Martha looked at him. I didn't make any administrative change. It may have been processed through representative, he said, keeping his voice even. A spouse or authorized party can make changes to supplemental coverage under certain. How much would it be without the coverage? He told her. She looked at the $5 bill in her coat pocket, and then she looked up at Gerald Okafor, and for a moment. The fluorescent lighting of the pharmacy and the soft hold music coming from the speakers near the blood pressure monitor and the slightly too warm air all pressed in against her at once. She was aware, acutely, of the woman behind her in line, young, impatient, shifting her weight. I'll call my doctor, Martha said. I'll sort it out. She took her card back and moved away from the counter. She stood near the greeting card rack for a moment, her hand resting on a cellophane-wrapped display of birthday cards. And she breathed carefully and deliberately the way she had learned to do in the years since retirement, when she had started to notice the particular quality of silence that preceded Warren saying something she would not be able to respond to in front of other people. She was not sick. She was not confused. Something had been done. The question was what, exactly, and how far it went. She left the pharmacy without the medication and walked 3 blocks to the dry cleaner and picked up Warren's pressed slacks, 2 pairs. The paper tickets already paid for by whatever method Warren used that she was no longer permitted to question. And then she sat down on the bench outside the dry cleaner and did what she had been trained, over 32 years at the library, to do when confronted with a gap in the record. She thought about what else might be missing. The Medicare change was not something that happened on its own. Administrative changes to supplemental drug coverage required a form, or a phone call to the plan provider, or an online account login. She had never set up an online account for her Medicare Part D. She had received the paper statements at the house and filed them in the beige accordion folder on the second shelf of the small bookcase in the spare bedroom. The bookcase Warren had begun referring to, in recent months, as the clutter. She had been meaning to go through that folder. She kept meaning to go through it. She picked up her dry cleaning and walked home. Warren was out WA board meeting, he had mentioned at breakfast without looking up from his phone. And the house was quiet in the specific way it was only when he was absent, not peaceful, exactly, but relieved. The smart devices still blinked their small green and amber lights from every room, but they felt less attentive somehow. The way a room full of security cameras feels slightly less watched when the person monitoring the feed steps away from the desk. Martha went directly to the spare bedroom. The accordion folder was where she had left it. She carried it to the kitchen table, better light, and she wanted to be able to hear the front door. And she opened it and began to go through the contents with the methodical attention she had applied to damaged documents in special collections. Every piece of paper was a source. Every source required verification. Every discrepancy was a note. The Medicare explanation of benefits statements were clipped together in the 3rd section. She spread them on the table in chronological order. The most recent one stopped her. It was a standard explanation of benefits form, the kind that arrived after a medical claim was processed, but the date of service was a Wednesday in early September. And the provider listed was a clinic in Center City she had never heard of, and the patient listed was Martha A. Miller, date of birth correct, Medicare number correct. And the claim was for a consultation with a specialist she had never seen for a condition she did not have. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, more slowly, the way you read a document when you already know what it says. But need to be certain that you are reading it correctly, that the words mean what you think they mean, that you have not made an error. She had not made an error. Someone had used her Medicare information to bill for a clinic visit. Someone had sat in an office somewhere in Center City on a Wednesday in September and given her name and her Medicare number and her date of birth, and a claim had been filed, and an EOB had been generated and mailed to her address. And it had arrived in the mail, and Warren had likely sorted it into the accordion folder himself on a day when she was out. Perhaps calculating that she would not look at it carefully, or perhaps not caring anymore whether she did. She set the EOB down on the kitchen table and looked at her hands. They were shaking slightly, the fine, visible tremor of someone whose blood pressure had just done something it ought not to have done, or simply of someone who had, in the space of one morning, discovered two separate violations of something she had believed, despite all evidence to the contrary, was still hers. Her medical coverage, her name. Then she looked at the accordion folder again. She had not checked the credit card section in some time. She kept one credit card, a Visa, through their bank, with a modest limit for household purchases. Groceries, occasionally, a birthday gift, postage. She paid it off monthly, or she had until the year Warren had suggested it was more efficient if he handled the bills. He had showed her the online payment confirmation once, 2 years ago, and she had not thought to ask again. She found the most recent credit card statement in the back of the folder, behind a sheaf of utility bills. The name on the account was Martha A. Miller. The account number was not one she recognized. She had never applied for this card. She had never signed any application. The statement showed a balance of $4,218, with charges going back 11 months. Restaurant charges, hardware store purchases, a recurring monthly charge to a service. She did not recognize a single large charge to a travel booking website for an amount that would have required her full month's pension check. She sat with the statement in her hands for a long time. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street. The Nest thermostat clicked quietly in the hallway. From somewhere in the house, the small chime of a smart device receiving a notification. Martha A. Miller. Her name, on an account she had never opened, carrying a debt she had never incurred, building a history she had never lived. She thought about the pharmacist's careful expression, the slight adjustment of his shoulders, the professional neutrality he had deployed to protect her from whatever he had read on his screen. She thought about the $5 bill in her coat pocket and the spreadsheet labeled, Household Efficiency, and the quarterly statement folded into the breast pocket of Warren's flannel shirt. "I'm not sick," she said, quietly, to the empty kitchen. Her voice was steady. "I'm just broke." The words landed in the silence of the house, and no one recorded them and no one heard them, and for a moment that felt, unexpectedly, like a kind of freedom. She refolded the credit card statement and placed it carefully back in the accordion folder. Then she took the folder upstairs, to the spare bedroom, and she did not put it back on the shelf. She put it under the spare mattress, in the far corner, where the bed frame met the wall. Then she went back downstairs and started thinking about what to do next. The annual WA Autumn meeting was held in the Millers' living room. It had been held there for 7 years running, ever since Warren's first election as WA president. A position he had campaigned for with the same organized intensity he had once brought to union contract negotiations. He had canvassed the block. He had printed a one-page platform on cream-colored cardstock protecting our community's legacy and distributed it personally to each of the 14 households on their street. He had won by 11 votes to 3. Martha had voted for him. She remembered thinking, at the time, that it seemed like a good use of his energy. That had been 7 years ago. Now she arranged the folding chairs in 2 rows facing the fireplace and set out the coffee service on the side table and put the grocery store cookies on a plate, and she did all of this while Warren stood at the mantelpiece, reviewing his notes, occasionally asking her to move a chair slightly or adjust the lamp angle. And she did these things without comment because the neighbors would arrive within the hour and the performance required preparation. They came in 2s and 3s, the Hendersons from next door. Ray and Dorothy, who had lived on the block for 30 years and still brought a pie to every neighborhood gathering out of a form of social inertia that Martha privately found comforting. The Patels from the corner house. Young Marcus Webb, who had moved in 18 months ago, and who still wore the slightly uncertain expression of a man who was not entirely sure what an HOA meeting required of him. Barbara Kowalski, who lived 2 doors down and who had appointed herself Warren's unofficial second-in-command the moment she realized he was someone worth being adjacent to. Martha brought out the coffee. She accepted compliments on the cookies. She said she was fine, thank you, yes the house looked lovely, you're very kind. Warren called the meeting to order. He was good at this, she had to acknowledge, as she had always acknowledged, that Warren Miller was exceptionally good at the performance of authority. He stood with his shoulders back and his voice measured, deploying the practiced ease of a man who had addressed union halls of 200 and knew how to make the person in the back row feel included. He went through the agenda items: the streetlight repair request to the city, the upcoming holiday decoration guidelines, the proposed amendment to the fence height ordinance that Marcus Webb had inquired about in September. And I'm pleased to report, Warren said, with the smile that reached his eyes in exactly the right proportion, that we've secured a commitment from the City Council office to repave the alley behind Crescent and Ardmore before spring. That's been a 7-year effort, and I'm proud to say this community's persistence paid off. There was genuine applause. Dorothy Henderson said, "Wonderful, Warren," with the warmth of someone who had never had reason to look behind the curtain, and Ray Henderson nodded with the slow approval of a man who trusted other men to handle things. And Martha sat in her chair near the side table and poured coffee and watched her husband accept the gratitude of their neighbors and felt something she could not quite name, not anger, not anymore, but something older and more structural, like discovering a load-bearing wall had been hollow all along. After the formal meeting, while people gathered in small clusters with their cookies and their coffee, Barbara Kowalski drifted toward Martha with the specific social purpose of someone who had information to deploy. "How are you doing, Martha?" "Really?" She said it the way people say really when they want you to understand that they already have an answer and are offering you the chance to confirm it. Martha looked at her. "I'm fine, Barbara. Thank you for asking." Warren mentioned. Barbara paused, with the practiced delicacy of a woman who had made a hobby of other people's private information, that you've been having some trouble keeping track of things lately. He was so sweet about it, so concerned. He said you've missed a few appointments. Did he? He said you'd get a letter and not remember reading it. That kind of thing. She touched Martha's arm briefly. "It's nothing to be ashamed of, you know. My mother started with the memory issues at 62. They have wonderful programs now." Martha kept her expression neutral. She had learned this at the library, the particular controlled stillness of a person who is receiving information she was not meant to know she was receiving, and who needs a moment to process its implications before she responds. "I appreciate your concern," she said. Barbara gave her arm one more pat and moved toward the cookie plate. Martha set down her coffee cup and looked across the room at Warren, who was accepting his re-election as WA president unopposed, naturally with an expression of modest gratitude. He caught her eye briefly and gave her the small, private nod he used when a social situation was going according to his expectations. And she nodded back because the performance required it, and the performance had always required it, and tonight she was not yet ready to stop performing. But she was cataloging. After the neighbors had gone and the folding chairs were stacked and the coffee cups washed and Warren had settled into his armchair with his tablet, Martha said she was going to get some fresh air and she put on her coat and she walked to the corner store 2 blocks away, the one that sold flowers on a sidewalk rack outside the door. A habit she had maintained for years, buying small bunches of flowers for friends or for the kitchen table, because it was one of the few personal expenditures Warren had never explicitly prohibited, perhaps because it seemed sufficiently domestic. She reached the rack and selected a small bunch of yellow chrysanthemums. Ruth Henley's birthday was Thursday. Ruth from her old book club, who still called on the landline every 2 weeks even though Martha could not always talk freely. She brought the flowers to the register and took out the debit card that Warren had given her 6 months ago. Her household account card, the sub-account he had set up so she would have access to funds, without having to ask him directly for every purchase. She slid the card. The register beeped once. The young man behind the counter looked at his screen. "It's showing declined," he said. Martha looked at the card in her hand. The card Warren had given her. The account he had configured for her use. "Can you try again?" she said, though she already knew. He tried again. "Declined. I'm sorry," the young man said. He had the grace not to look at her directly. Martha took the card back and put it in her pocket and set the chrysanthemums back in the bucket on the counter. "I'm sorry to trouble you," she said, and her voice came out perfectly even, perfectly composed. And she walked out of the store and down the 2 blocks to her house and went in through the back door. Warren was still in his armchair. She hung up her coat and said she was going to bed early, and he said good night without looking up from his tablet. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed. And thought about the WA meeting, about Barbara Kowalski's hand on her arm, about the word programs and the careful, knowing expression it had arrived with. She thought about the debit card in her pocket, which had worked 3 weeks ago and did not work tonight. She thought about the flowers she had not been able to buy for Ruth Henley's birthday. Then she thought about something else. Earlier that week, while Warren had been at his Tuesday lunch with the retired union men, she had been straightening the hall closet, one of the tasks he assigned, by leaving a note on the kitchen counter, and she had found his golf bag behind the winter coats. She had not been looking for anything. She had simply been moving the bag to reach the box of holiday decorations behind it, and when she moved it, something inside had shifted and the outer pocket had fallen open, and inside the pocket, folded into thirds and tucked beneath a scorecard and a spare golf glove, she had found a document. She had not touched it, not that day. But she had read enough of it to see the name on the first line, their address and the words reverse mortgage agreement, and the signature on the last page, and the amount. She had stood in the hall closet for a long moment, the golf bag still in her hand, the document visible in the unzipped pocket, and she had made a careful decision. She had placed the bag back where it was, exactly as it had been, and she had finished straightening the closet, and she had said nothing. Because the document was not addressed to her. Because her name was not on it, only Warren's. Because their home, the house she had lived in for 41 years, the house with the cracked coffee mug handle, and the maple tree in the backyard and 2 cats buried beside the fence, was being used as collateral for something she had never been asked about, never informed of, never given the opportunity to understand. And because Warren had thought she would not find it, and she needed him to keep thinking that. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sound of the smart speaker in the hallway receiving a notification, a small, cheerful chime. A sound designed by engineers to feel reassuring, and she thought about all the information in this house that moved through channels she could not access, to a phone she was not permitted to look at. And she felt something harden in the center of her chest that was not anger and was not despair, but was something in between, the particular cold clarity of a person who has stopped being surprised and started being prepared. The kitchen lights went out at 7:14 on a Thursday evening. Martha was eating alone. Warren had taken his dinner earlier, in front of the television in the den, which had become the custom in recent months without any formal announcement, the way so many things in this house had become custom without announcement. She was halfway through a bowl of vegetable soup and a piece of toast. And she was reading, her book propped against the fruit bowl, and then the overhead lights simply ceased. Not a bulb failure. A bulb failure had a warning, a flicker, a subtle degradation over time, the gradual loss of confidence of something approaching the end of its useful life. This was immediate and total, the kitchen going from yellow warmth to the flat gray of late October evening light coming through the window. And Martha looked up from her book and looked at the smart switch panel on the wall, which showed a faint amber glow confirming that power was not the issue. And she understood, in the way she had learned to understand things in this house, that the lights had been turned off by someone sitting in another room with a tablet in his lap. She sat for a moment in the gray light. Then she reached across the table, found the small battery-powered book light she kept in the kitchen drawer. She had started keeping it there in September. Telling herself it was for power outages, telling herself that was the only reason, and she clipped it to her book and finished her soup. She did not say anything. She did not go to the den. She finished her meal and washed her bowl and her spoon and her glass in the dark kitchen with the small book light clipped to the windowsill above the sink. And she went through the motions with the precise, deliberate economy of a woman who has decided that her composure is the last thing in this house that belongs entirely to her. And she will not surrender it for the satisfaction of the person who turned off the light. Afterward, she went upstairs to the spare bedroom. She had been spending more time in the spare bedroom in recent weeks, which Warren had noted with the mild, pointed observation that she seemed to be avoiding the living room. And she had said she was just organizing, which was true in ways she could not yet say aloud. She had the accordion folder under the mattress and a legal pad in the nightstand drawer. And she had been writing notes, not a diary, nothing so vulnerable, but a cataloging system. Dates, amounts, document names, observations. The same system she would have used in special collections to establish the provenance of a suspicious document. She sat on the spare bed and opened the nightstand drawer and took out the legal pad. And then she found the power of attorney. It was not where she had expected to find anything. It was tucked inside a manila folder she had placed in the drawer weeks ago. A folder she had assumed contained only blank printer paper she'd brought upstairs for her notes. She did not know how it had gotten there. Possibly Warren had placed it. Possibly she had picked it up with other papers without noticing. The how of it did not matter as much as the what. She opened the folder. The document was 4 pages, standard legal formatting, the language dense and formal in the way of legal instruments designed to be understood by attorneys and no one else. She read it slowly, the way she read everything, line by line, with the part of her mind that had been trained not to skim, not to assume, to let every sentence arrive on its own terms. Durable power of attorney for financial matters. Granted by Martha Ann Miller. Her name, her date of birth, her social security number, last 4 digits. Granted to Warren James Miller. She turned to the signature page. She had not signed this document. She had not sat before a notary and placed her hand on a pen and formed the letters of her name in the particular way. She had been signing things since she was 18 years old. The slight leftward lean of the M. The open loop of the H. The way the final R of Miller trailed downward in a small, distinctive hook she had never been able to stop herself from making. She knew her signature the way she knew her own handwriting because it was hers, had been hers for decades. Was as much a part of her physical vocabulary as the way she held a cup or folded a letter. The signature on the last page of this document was not quite right. It was close. It was very close, close enough to pass a casual inspection, close enough to satisfy a notary who was not looking carefully, close enough that Martha suspected it had, at some point, already passed. But the M was wrong. The lean was wrong. The hook at the end of Miller was absent. Whoever had signed this document had studied her signature and reproduced it with considerable care and had not been able to get the hook right. She sat on the spare bed with the document in both hands and the book light clipping its small pale circle onto the page. And she thought about what this meant with the same deliberate, methodical attention she had always brought to things that needed to be properly understood before they could be properly handled. This document, if real, if accepted as real by a bank, a court, a medical facility, any institution that dealt in the legal transfer of authority over another person's life, gave Warren Miller complete control over her finances, her property, her medical decisions, her legal standing. Everything. It was not a partial transfer of responsibility. It was not a convenience document for tax season or a hospital stay. It was total. She thought about the 401k statement she had not been permitted to open. The credit card in her name she had never applied for. The Medicare coverage changed by an authorized party. The sub-account debit card that had stopped working. The reverse mortgage document in the golf bag. She thought about how long this had been in preparation. She set the document down on the bed beside her and sat very still. She tried to work out when she could call someone. Not from the house landline. Warren received the itemized bill online and she had seen him review it. Not from the cell phone he had provided her a smartphone. The kind that could be monitored remotely, that she had always been reluctant to use for anything she did not want him to know. The flip phone in the garden shed was not accessible now. It was dark outside. And she did not have a reason to go to the shed at this hour that Warren would accept without question. She picked up the landline on the nightstand, the spare bedroom extension, and she dialed the number she still knew by heart. The number she had dialed 100 times before everything had gotten complicated, before the distance between them had become so large and so freighted with history that calling felt like an act that required more courage than she had reliably available. Sarah's number. 4 rings. 5. A recorded message. You've reached Sarah Miller. I'm unavailable right now. Please leave a message, and I'll return your call as soon as I can. Martha opened her mouth to speak, and heard instead the small, audible click of the call terminating, not the natural click of a voicemail picking up, but the abrupt, clean click of an outgoing call being blocked. The line went quiet. Not dead. She could hear the slight ambient static of an open connection, but silent in the way of a call that had gone nowhere. Been caught at its source by something that had assessed the outgoing number and made a decision. She set the receiver down. She sat on the spare bedroom floor. She wasn't sure when she had moved from the bed to the floor with her back against the side of the mattress and her knees drawn up. And the power of attorney document face down on the bed above her, and she held her mother's old recipe box. The one she kept on the spare room bookshelf, the one with the index cards in her mother's handwriting, the familiar loops and careful letters of a woman who had also spent her life managing things that other people did not value, and she pressed the box against her chest and breathed. The house settled around her in its evening sounds. A pipe ticked somewhere in the wall. The smart speaker in the hallway received another notification, that cheerful, insistent chime. From downstairs, the muted sound of the television. She had spent 41 years in this house. She had raised her daughter here, and buried her cats here, and catalogued the contents of her life here. With the same patient attention she had brought to everything she had ever been trusted to care for. She had believed, in the way you believe things that are foundational, that the man she had married was the same man who had held her hand at her father's funeral and said, "I've got you," in a voice that had seemed, at the time, like the most reliable thing in the world. She had stopped believing that gradually, and then all at once, the way books deteriorated slowly at first, invisibly, and then in the span of one moment when you open the cover and the spine cracks and the pages come loose in your hands and you understand that the damage was never superficial. She was 65 years old and she was sitting on the floor of her own spare bedroom in the dark, and she could not call her daughter. But there was a flip phone and a hollowed-out dictionary in the garden shed. And she had written 11 pages of notes on a legal pad. And she had, underneath everything, the thing that 41 years of managing other people's underestimation had given her: patience, and precision, and the absolute, bedrock certainty of a woman who has spent her career locating things that other people believed were lost. She unclenched her hands from her mother's recipe box. She breathed once, carefully. And she began to think about what came next. Friends, thank you for staying with Martha's story. In these first 4 sequences, we've watched a woman who spent 32 years as a librarian, a woman who cataloged 10,000 rare documents, who could locate a missing legal deed in 45 minutes. Discover that the most important records she ever failed to protect were her own. Warren turned off her lights. He blocked her calls. He signed her name on documents she never saw. And with every small act of control, he was betting on the same thing: that Martha would feel too ashamed, too confused, too isolated to fight back. He was wrong about a lot of things. But he was most wrong about that. In the second half of our story, Martha is done being managed. She's going to use every skill she has, and she has quite a few, to take back what's hers. Stay with us. The best part is coming. There was a photograph on the spare bedroom bookshelf. She had looked at it so many times over the years that she had stopped seeing it, the way you stop seeing a familiar painting on a wall. That showed her father standing in front of his hardware store on Lehigh Avenue in the summer of 1983. He was wearing his work apron, and he was squinting slightly in the sun. And he looked exactly like what he was: a man who had spent 30 years building something small and sturdy and entirely his own. He had died in the spring of 1985, and he had left her the store. Not the building had been leased, but the business itself. The tools and the inventory and the goodwill and, most significantly, the small amount of capital he had accumulated in a savings account over decades of careful management. $11,000. In 1985, that was not nothing. She had been 24 years old and newly married, and Warren had sat across the kitchen table from her the week after the funeral with a yellow legal pad and a ballpoint pen. And he had been so kind, so steady, so utterly certain of himself, and he had said, "Let me take care of this for you. You're grieving. You don't need to be dealing with accounts right now. Let me handle the transfer." And she had let him. She had been grieving. That was true. And he had handled the transfer, just as he had said he would. And the money had gone into a joint account she had believed they both had access to. And within 8 months Warren had made an investment that he described as strategic and that had, by his account, not performed as expected, and the $11,000 was gone. She had never questioned it. Not really. Not in the way that produced answers. She had asked once, gently, 2 years later, whether there was any record of the investment, and Warren had looked at her with such patient, faintly pained understanding. "I know it's hard, Martha. I know it feels like a loss on top of a loss," that she had felt ashamed of asking and had not asked again. She had catalogued that feeling now. Added it to the legal pad. Added it to the column of things that looked, in retrospect, like a pattern. Every moment she had come into something of her own: the inheritance, the promotion at the library, the small retirement gift from her colleagues of a savings bond she had mentioned offhandedly. Warren had positioned himself between her and it, and a financial crisis had followed, and the thing had been absorbed. Not loved. Liquidated. She sat in the spare room with the legal pad on her knee and she wrote the year 1985 at the top of a fresh page. And then she wrote 1991, the year of the library promotion and the subsequent, unexpected home repair, that had drained their savings, and then 1998, and 2003. And she wrote the amounts beside each year as best she could reconstruct them, and the pattern on the page was so clear, so orderly, so legible that she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not despair, something more like recognition. She remembered, from her years in special collections, the experience of working with a document that had been deliberately obscured, a manuscript with redactions, a letter with passages inked over, a photograph with figures carefully cropped from the edges. The work of restoration was not dramatic. It did not involve sudden revelations. It involved patience and light and the willingness to sit with a thing long enough that its original shape began to come back through the damage. She was 65 years old and she was sitting in the spare bedroom of her own house and she was doing exactly that. The life insurance policy had been the thing that cracked it open. She had found it 3 weeks ago, tucked into the back of the same accordion folder, behind the EOB statements, inside a manila envelope she had always assumed contained old tax documents Warren had transferred to her folder by mistake. The policy was from her father's estate, issued through an insurer she had never heard of, with a beneficiary designation listing Martha Ann Miller and a face value that Warren had told her, in the weeks after the funeral, was invalid due to a lapsed premium. She had never seen a lapse notice. She had never seen the policy at all. Warren had handled the estate paperwork, just as he had handled everything else. And she had trusted him to tell her what there was. But here it was, and it did not appear to be lapsed. Whether it was still valid after 40 years was a question for someone with a law license, which she did not have. But the fact of its existence, the fact that Warren had told her it did not exist, while it was sitting in her own accordion folder in her own spare bedroom, was not a legal question. It was a personal one, and she had already answered it. She closed the legal pad and sat for a moment with the photograph of her father on the shelf across from her, the man squinting in the 1983 summer light, the apron strings tied in a practical knot at his back. He had built his store carefully and left it to her deliberately, and she had been 24 and grieving. And she had handed it to Warren, and that was the truth of it. But she was not 24 anymore. She was 65, and she had 11 pages of notes, and a flip phone in a dictionary, and the accumulated knowledge of a career spent understanding that the most important skill in any archive was not finding what was there. It was recognizing what had been removed, and why, and by whom. She knew what had been removed. She was beginning to understand what she was going to do about it. The Tacony branch of the Free Library of Philadelphia was 11 blocks from the house, close enough to walk on a mild day. Far enough that Martha had a reasonable excuse to be gone for 2 hours without Warren questioning the duration. She had been going regularly for 3 weeks, not every day, but often enough that it had become, in the household's vocabulary, simply, Martha's library day. A habit Warren appeared to find vaguely appropriate for a retired librarian in the same way he found her gardening appropriate. Which was to say contained, harmless, and domestically legible. He did not know what she was doing there. She left her smartphone, the one he had given her, the one connected to the Find My Device feature she had noticed in his phone's app library 6 months ago. While looking for the calculator, she left it on the kitchen counter on library days. Telling Warren she forgot it, which he accepted because it confirmed a narrative he was already invested in. She had confirmed, with Gerald Okafor at the pharmacy, that the smartphone he'd given her had an account linked to Warren's primary plan. Gerald had figured it out in 3 minutes when she described the situation carefully, in the language of a woman asking a hypothetical question about a friend. On the day she met Sandra Vance, she left the smartphone at home and stopped at the grocery store on Frankfurt Avenue. Where she used the coin-operated locker near the entrance installed, she had always assumed, for bicycle riders and parents with strollers to leave her transit card and her wallet. Which she had read, in an article she found at the library, could also be used to track location through embedded RFID signals. She was aware this was perhaps excessive. She did it anyway. Then she walked to the coffee shop on the avenue, 3 blocks from the library, where she had arranged to meet Sandra Vance at 10 in the morning on a Thursday, using the flip phone. Sandra was already there when Martha arrived, seated at a corner table with a cup of coffee and a leather portfolio, wearing reading glasses on a chain and the measured, unhurried manner of a woman who had spent 20 years in family law and understood, from the first phone call, what she was dealing with. She was 42, with short natural hair and the kind of alert stillness that Martha associated with people who listened for a living. "Mrs. Miller," she said, standing briefly. "I'm glad you called." "Sandra." Martha sat down. She had the accordion folder with her, inside a canvas library tote, the kind she had carried for decades. Unremarkable, invisible in the way of objects that were exactly what they appeared to be. She placed the folder on the table. "I need to show you some documents," she said. "And I need to know if I'm reading them correctly, or if I've been in this house so long that I'm seeing patterns that aren't there." Sandra looked at her steadily. "Let me see." Martha opened the folder and laid out the documents with the same care she would have brought to a special collections table. The fraudulent credit card statement first. Then the Medicare EOB for the clinic visit she had not made. Then the power of attorney with the forged signature. Then the reverse mortgage document she had spent 4 careful evenings photocopying while Warren slept, feeding pages through the all-in-one printer in the spare room. One at a time with the sound muted, the way you handle documents that cannot be damaged. Sandra read. She read the way a lawyer reads, without expression. Without the involuntary reactions that most people have when confronted with something that crosses a line. She turned each page deliberately, went back twice to reread sections of the power of attorney, and spent the longest time with the reverse mortgage document, tracing one column of figures with her finger. When she was done, she removed her reading glasses and looked at Martha. "How long?" she said. Martha understood the question. "I think it started when my father died. 1985. But the documents I can prove go back 11 months, minimum." She paused. "Possibly longer. I haven't had access to the full financial records. The 401k. He intercepts the statements. I haven't seen one in over a year." Sandra made a note. She wrote quickly and precisely, the way someone writes when they are transcribing known categories of information onto a familiar map. "This signature," Sandra said, touching the power of attorney. "You're certain it isn't yours?" "I'm certain." Martha held up her right hand and traced the shape of her signature in the air, the M, the lean, the loop, the hook at the end. "I know my own hand. The hook is missing. It's close, but it's wrong." "That's going to matter." Sandra capped her pen. "Mrs. Miller, what you have here is identity theft, financial elder abuse, and potentially criminal fraud. The credit card alone is a federal violation. The power of attorney, if it was notarized under a forged signature, is a felony. And the reverse mortgage, she paused. The reverse mortgage is the most urgent item. Depending on how far the process has proceeded, there's a timeline involved. Martha nodded. She had known there was a timeline. She had been working against it without knowing exactly what it was. I need to find out about the 401k, she said. I believe he's been redirecting contributions. Possibly for years. Do you have the account administrator's information? She reached into the folder and produced the quarterly statement, the one that had arrived, months ago, that she had memorized before Warren took it. The account number she had written from memory on the legal pad the same evening. She had not told Warren she had memorized it. She slid it across the table to Sandra. The account number is accurate, she said. I retained it. Sandra looked at the number, then at Martha, with an expression that was not quite surprise. But was the professional equivalent of it a slight recalibration, the adjustment a person makes when they have assessed a situation and the situation is better resourced than expected? You've been thorough, Sandra said. I was a librarian for 32 years. Martha folded her hands on the table. He thinks I'm a closed book. She held Sandra's gaze. He doesn't realize I'm the one who writes the index. Sandra picked up her pen. They worked for an hour and 40 minutes. Martha provided dates, amounts, account numbers she had transcribed from memory. The sequential log of incidents she had been building on the legal pad since October. Sandra took notes in her portfolio and asked precise questions. And occasionally made the small sound of a person confirming a hypothesis she had already largely formed. When they were done, Sandra organized her notes and looked at Martha across the table. I'm going to file for an emergency asset freeze, she said. That stops any further disbursement from the accounts while the court reviews the fraud claims. I'll also petition for a digital restraining order. There's a specific provision in Pennsylvania elder financial abuse law that covers smart home surveillance systems used as control mechanisms. It's newer case law, but it applies here. Martha absorbed this. How long? Filing within the week. Emergency hearings move faster than standard docket. 2 to 3 weeks for the initial freeze order, if the judge agrees the evidence supports it. She paused. You'll need to stay in the house until the filing, for your legal standing. Can you do that? Yes, Martha said. She had been doing it for 41 years. She walked back to the grocery store, retrieved her transit card from the locker, put it back in her wallet, and took the bus home. The smartphone was where she had left it on the kitchen counter. She picked it up and carried it upstairs and put it on the charger in the bedroom and went downstairs and started thinking about dinner. Warren came in at 5:30 and she had a chicken casserole in the oven. And he said it smelled good, and she said thank you, and neither of them said anything important, and the house moved through its evening routines exactly as it always did. And Martha moved through them with the same careful composure she had been maintaining for months. But she was not, anymore, simply enduring. She was counting down. The courtroom in the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas was a large, high-ceilinged room that smelled of old wood and radiator heat. And the specific accumulated gravity of a space where consequential things happened regularly. Martha had been in courtrooms before, once for jury duty, years ago. And once when a neighbor had contested a property line and had asked her to appear as a witness to a conversation she'd overheard in the alley. Both times, she had found the formal architecture of the legal process reassuring in the way she found libraries reassuring, organized, procedural. Subject to rules that were written down and available to anyone who knew where to look. She sat at the plaintiff's table with Sandra beside her, and she looked at her hands, which were steady, and she thought about the hook at the end of her signature that Warren had not been able to replicate, and she thought about 11 pages of notes on a legal pad, and she was ready. Warren was at the defendant's table with an attorney from a firm in Chestnut Hill, a man named Peterson, white-haired and unhurried, who had the bearing of someone who had built a career on the assumption that older women in domestic disputes were manageable. He had looked at Martha when she entered the courtroom, with the particular measuring expression of someone assessing a problem's difficulty and finding it modest. She had noted this and said nothing. The judge was a woman named Elaine Carroll, 68 years old, assigned by what Sandra had described as a fortunate rotation. She wore reading glasses on a chain similar to Sandra's, and she moved through the preliminary matters with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been doing this for a long time and had strong opinions about the value of other people's time. Sandra presented the emergency asset freeze petition first. She laid out the case in the organized, precise manner Martha had come to recognize as her working mode: the forged power of attorney, the unauthorized credit card, the Medicare identity theft, the reverse mortgage encumbrance on the property. She presented each document as it was introduced into evidence. And the courtroom was quiet in the way that courtrooms are when information is landing with weight. Warren's attorney offered the expected objections that the power of attorney was a legitimate document, that the administrative changes to Medicare coverage were made with Mrs. Miller's full knowledge, that the reverse mortgage had been disclosed to both parties and was a reasonable financial decision. Judge Carroll looked over her reading glasses at the attorney. "Counselor, are you prepared to produce the notarized disclosure forms for the reverse mortgage agreement, signed by both parties?" Peterson said they would be produced in discovery. Judge Carroll wrote something on her notepad. Sandra then presented what she had told Martha, when preparing for today, would be the most significant element of the case: the smart home logs. It took a moment for the room to understand what it was looking at. Sandra had obtained the data, through a subpoena to the smart home device company, of every remote command issued through Warren Miller's user account over a 14-month period. The data had been presented as a table, and as a timeline, and as a series of specific incidents. Date, time, device, action that told a story with the unambiguous clarity of machine-generated records. October 14, 7:14 p.m. Kitchen overhead light. Command off. Issued remotely via iPad. Duration 47 minutes. September 22. Outgoing call to 215 area number. Blocked via parental control application on household account. Destination number: Sarah E. Miller. Multiple dates. Thermostat set to 64 degrees, locked remotely. Override requests by secondary account user 23. Approved by primary account 0. Judge Carroll read the timeline in silence. The courtroom was very quiet. Martha watched Warren at the defendant's table. He was sitting in the posture she knew well: the slight forward lean, the hands flat on the table. The expression of a man preparing a response that would reframe whatever had just been said. Peterson leaned over to murmur something, and Warren leaned back slightly and nodded with the controlled patience of a man who believed the situation was still manageable. He looked, in that moment, precisely like what he was: a man who had managed his wife for 41 years. And was having difficulty accepting that the management structure had changed. "Mrs. Miller," Judge Carroll said, looking directly at Martha. "The smart home records indicate that a call to your daughter's phone number was blocked on multiple occasions. Is that consistent with your experience?" Martha looked at the judge. "Yes, Your Honor. On the specific date shown in the log, I attempted to call my daughter from the spare bedroom extension. The call was terminated before it connected. I had been attempting to reach her for some time. And the thermostat restrictions. The Nest thermostat has been set remotely at 64 degrees for 11 months. I have documentation of my requests to adjust it. The device logs show 23 override attempts by the secondary account, that is my account, with 0 approvals." Judge Carroll looked at the logs again. Then she looked at Warren. "Mr. Miller," she said, "is there an explanation for the pattern of remote commands reflected in these records?" Peterson said his client would respond in full at the appropriate stage of proceedings. Warren said, "I was managing the household efficiently." He said it in the voice he used for WA meetings: measured, reasonable, the voice of a man who was accustomed to being believed. "My wife has had difficulty with Mr. Miller," Judge Carroll said. She said it simply and without particular emphasis, and it was enough. Warren stopped. The judge returned to her notepad. She wrote for a longer time than Martha expected. The asset freeze was granted that afternoon. All joint accounts, the retirement account, and the accounts in Warren's name that had been identified through Sandra's pre-filing investigation were frozen pending a full financial audit. The reverse mortgage was flagged for immediate review by the State Department of Financial Protection. The power of attorney, entered as evidence, was referred for forensic handwriting analysis. The digital restraining order, the provision Sandra had described as newer case law, was also granted. Warren Miller was required to remove his administrative access from the smart home devices. The household telephone account, and all financial accounts linked to Martha Miller's personal identifying information, effective immediately. Warren's WA status was addressed separately, but with notable speed. Barbara Kowalski, it turned out, had attended the morning session of the hearing. By 3 in the afternoon, the WA board had convened an emergency vote. Warren Miller was removed as president by a margin of 9-2. The two dissenting votes being his own and the vote of a neighbor who had not been present and whose proxy Warren had arranged in advance. Martha did not hear about this until Sandra told her, in the parking lot after the hearing concluded. She stood in the cold November air with her canvas tote bag, and the thought of the thermostat of 23 denied requests to make her own house. The temperature at which she was not cold, and she breathed, carefully and deliberately. Sandra handed her a copy of the freeze order. "This is your copy," she said. "Keep it somewhere safe." Martha held the document. The paper was warm from the copy machine, and it felt entirely unlike the paper she had been reading for the last 3 months. The statements she had not been permitted to open, the documents forged with her name, the notices hidden in golf bags. This paper had her name on it, at the top, in the appropriate place, placed there by a judge who had read the smart home logs and understood what they meant. When she signed her own name at the bottom, her initials on the copy acknowledgement, the M with its leftward lean and the hook at the end of Miller. That Warren had never been able to get right, the pen moved in her hand. With the easy confidence of a woman who had been signing her own name for 65 years and was, today, doing it for herself. The pen felt like it carried the weight of 41 winters. And she had never, in all those years, felt lighter. The new apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Diston Street. 6 blocks from the library, in a neighborhood she had always liked for its corner stores and its old oak trees and its general attitude of getting on with things. It was small, a 1-bedroom, with a kitchen that was narrow, but well lit, and a living room that fit her bookshelves with a few inches to spare on each side, and it cost her more per month than she had initially calculated. But Sandra had been able to secure a portion of her pension and a preliminary disbursement from the 401k audit pending the full financial review. And she had managed the numbers herself, on a legal pad, the same way she had managed everything in the past 3 months, and the numbers worked. She moved in on a Saturday in late November, 2 weeks after the hearing. She did not take much from the house: some clothes, her books, her mother's recipe box, the blue ceramic mug with the cracked handle that she had been meaning to replace for 3 years and had decided, instead, to keep. The court order allowed her to remove her personal property, and she had arranged, through Sandra, for Warren to be at his brother's house in Drexel Hill for the day. She did not want a scene. She had spent enough time in scenes. She wanted a Saturday morning with 2 borrowed friends from the library board, a rented van, and the uncomplicated business of carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs. By 2 in the afternoon, the boxes were in and the borrowed friends had gone home, and Martha was alone in her new apartment, with the autumn light coming through the living room window and the quiet particular to a space that was hers. Only, that had never been anything else. That had never been managed or monitored or accessed remotely by someone who viewed her as a variable in a household efficiency spreadsheet. She walked to the thermostat. It was a simple manual dial, no app, no smartphone connection, no user permissions required. She turned it clockwise, slowly, past 68, past 70, past 72, and stopped at 74. She stood in front of it for a moment. 74 degrees. Warm. Deliberately, extravagantly, joyfully warm. The heat came up through the baseboard heaters in a slow, reliable wave, and Martha stood in the middle of her small living room and felt the warmth of a house that was set to the temperature she wanted, and she understood, in a way she could not have explained to someone who had not been cold for 11 months in their own home, exactly what 74 degrees meant. She made coffee in the narrow kitchen. She put her blue ceramic mug on the counter beside the coffee maker, and while she waited for it to brew, she looked out the kitchen window at Diston Street, at the oak trees with their last brown leaves, at the 2 children on bicycles. making their way down the sidewalk with the concentrated seriousness of small people engaged in important work. It was an ordinary view. She was grateful for it in the specific, conscious way you are grateful for ordinary things after a period in which ordinary things have been rationed. Her phone rang. Her phone, the new one, the modest prepaid smartphone Sandra had helped her set up, with an account in her own name, linked to nothing except itself. Accessible only to people she had chosen to give the number to. The screen said Sarah Miller. Martha looked at it for one ring. Then she answered, "Mom." Sarah's voice came through with the slight careful quality of someone who has been rehearsing a call. And has decided, at the last moment, to abandon the script and simply speak. "How are you? How is the new place?" "Warm," Martha said. She sat down at her small kitchen table, the coffee maker still running behind her. "I just set the thermostat." A pause. "What temperature?" 74. There was a sound on the other end that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob but lived in the same neighborhood as both. "Good," Sarah said. "That's good, Mom." They had not spoken at length in 3 years. The distance between them had been constructed gradually, over many smaller distances. And Martha had believed for a long time that the primary material of its construction was her own failures, the ways she had not fought harder, not left sooner. Not called more persistently, not been, in some aggregate, the mother her daughter had needed her to be. She had learned, in the past months, to examine that belief with the same scrutiny. She brought to any other document of questionable provenance carefully, without predetermined conclusions, looking for what the evidence actually said. What the evidence said was that her calls had been blocked. That her daughter had not known, for years, how much of the silence between them had been engineered. "I'd like to see you," Martha said. "If you're willing. Not to explain everything, not all at once. Just coffee." Another pause. Longer this time, but not empty, the pause of someone reorganizing, adjusting the structure of a feeling they had held in a particular shape for a long time. "I know a place," Sarah said. "In Manayunk. They have good scones." "I'll treat," Martha said. "Mom, you don't have to." "I have a pension check," Martha said, "in an account with my name on it, and I intend to spend some of it on coffee and scones with my daughter." She paused. "Let me treat." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said, and the word had something in it that Martha recognized from years ago, from the version of her daughter that had existed before the distance. Before the engineered silences, simple, and warm, and real. They agreed on a date. They said goodbye with the slight formality of people who are carefully rebuilding something and know it, and are being careful on purpose. Martha set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. This phone, in this apartment, in this name, and she thought about the Nest thermostat set at 64 degrees and the $5 bill on the kitchen counter. And the 401k statement folded into a breast pocket and the power of attorney with the wrong signature. And she thought about all the years she had spent cataloging other people's irreplaceable things, learning their provenance and their condition and their value. And she understood what she had been slow to understand, that the most important collection she had ever been responsible for was the one she had been building for 65 years. Composed of everything she had ever known and survived and cataloged and carried. Her worth. Her word, her name, signed in her own hand, with the hook at the end of Miller that was hers and no one else's. She poured her coffee into the blue ceramic mug with the cracked handle. She sat at her kitchen table in her warm apartment on Diston Street, and the light came through the window in the particular slanted way of November afternoons in Philadelphia. And she opened her new library book. She had taken 4 books from the branch on her way to the van this morning. Because she could. Because she had a library card in her own name at an address that was hers, and she began to read. At 65, she had finally learned what she had always, in some part of herself, known, that the most important thing she had ever catalogued was herself. Her own value, her own history, the long, particular record of a life that had been managed and minimized and underestimated, and that had endured all of it, and was not finished. Not even close. Friends. How did you find Martha's story today? I've been sitting with it since we started, and I keep coming back to one small detail 23 times. Martha tried 23 times to change the temperature in her own home. And 23 times, the man she had trusted for 41 years said no, not with words. but with a tablet and a remote access code and the quiet, technological certainty that she would not know how to fight back. He was wrong. What stayed with me about Martha isn't the courtroom victory, or the asset freeze, or even the moment Warren's careful WA persona finally crumbled under the weight of a machine-generated log file. What stayed with me is the hollowed-out dictionary in the garden shed, the $12 flip phone, the 11 pages of notes on a legal pad, written in the spare bedroom at night, while the smart devices blinked their little lights in the hallway. Martha didn't have a lawyer yet. She didn't have a plan yet. She had her librarian's discipline one document at a time, one verified fact at a time, the patient, unshakable belief that if you catalog something carefully enough, the truth of it becomes undeniable. We all have moments when we're sitting on a cold floor in a dark room, holding onto the only thing we have left that belongs to us. And in those moments, the thing that carries us forward isn't always strength in the way we picture it. Sometimes it's something quieter, a system, a habit. The slow accumulation of evidence that says I was here, I paid attention, and I know exactly what happened. I hope Martha's story brought you a little warmth today. 74 degrees worth, at least. If this story reached you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or something you've carried, or a moment when you found your footing again,